Well, hello there, and welcome to another Friday night for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Of course, as always, I'm Rafael di Furia, back at it again to talk more about life abroad, living abroad as an Italian dual citizen expat, and all of the fun stuff that comes along with it. This episode specifically, I wanted to do a compare and contrast between living in Italy as an expat versus living in Portugal as an expat, living in either of these countries. Because as time has gone on, just being here in Portugal, just shy of 3 months actually living here now, having been here plenty of times before, but actually living here just shy of 3 months, and in Italy just shy of 5 years. Thought it might be good to do a bit of a comparison, because I know there are some of you out there who are actually considering between the two countries, and the more that I talk to expats, and also there have been a number of you who've messaged me who've been saying that you've actually been considering the choice between Italy and Portugal, and kind of funny that I ended up happening to be here, so this one is for you guys. But just before we get into the rest of this episode, a huge thank you to those of you who help to make these episodes possible through patreon.com/Rafael di Furia, or the one-time donations through rafaeldifuria.com/support, or the shirts, mugs, onesies, and more that help to make these episodes possible. Truly, thank you all so very much for helping me to be able to consider making more of these. Anyway, I think it's about time that we hop into this episode, so roll that intro. I think the first place that I want to get started out in this episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter is comparing and contrasting moving to Italy versus moving to Portugal, the actual practical part of it. And I would say in many ways, you'll find similarities. But it seems as though when there is a move that involves Italy a part of it, all of a sudden, international movers, if you are going to be moving some of your items along with you, they start all of a sudden to get a little bit worried or concerned and saying, well, it gets expensive and this and that. And I've done a number of international moves. I've helped friends and family and others with their international moves. And for whatever reason, the Italian moves always seem to be the most expensive, and I would assume this has to do with the road tolls and various taxes and fees that go along with it. I don't know exactly the reasons, but I would assume. So if you are going to be bringing, say, like a container or a partial container with you, because sometimes the cost of doing that can actually be the same, if not less, than refurnishing your whole new place that you're going to be moving to. It also depends on what type of furniture you have. If you have like IKEA furniture, definitely not worth moving it, especially if you have like a Kallax unit or something like that. Although granted, that I don't know if you can quite see this behind me right here. This is a Kallax unit, and it was a smaller one. So I did bring it with me because it was very light, and it wasn't because I have some of like the drawers and those inserts in there. I did bring that with me because it wasn't like really that big of a deal. But generally speaking, I wouldn't really advise bringing IKEA furniture with you because it can really easily get broken, especially if, like, again, Kallax, because it happens to be one of their more popular units. If you have one of the bigger Kallax units that can't really even support itself under its own weight, having something like that may not be the best idea. But I have seen Portugal does seem to be a cheaper option, and there are more movers that are willing to deal with a relocation to the country. So in that sense, I would say Portugal does pull ahead a little bit. But when we're talking about actually getting to the place, moving yourself to the country, that's something where I might give Italy a little bit of an advantage and say that really it might pull ahead of Portugal because you have a lot more airports and a lot more options. Granted, it is a much larger country. So okay, you're not going to need so many different options. In Portugal, I mean, you have Porto, Lisbon, and Faro are kind of the main airports, at least on the mainland. But I will say also, just getting into this, that this episode really isn't meant to be any kind of, oh, this country is better or this country is better. And I'm not going to keep a tally of which country is earning more points or anything. This is just about some of the specific things that I've come across and what I see that would give an advantage to a move to one country or the other. But the other thing that we have to talk about when moving to a country is talking about actually legally being able to move there. In this instance, I would say that Portugal would be maybe the one that would be the quote unquote winner, just especially because if you're somebody who's not a European Union citizen, or even if you are an EU citizen, moving to Portugal and getting a visa to be able to stay here and remain here and have residency here is probably going to be a lot easier than it would be for Italy. Italy has a very restrictive and very difficult system. Okay, if you're going to be retiring to Italy, yeah, in that case, maybe it wouldn't be all that difficult, but you would probably have higher income or social security that you would have to be able to prove to the Italian government than you would have to demonstrate to the Portuguese. That is not legal advice. That is just based on what information I do know. So if you are planning to move here, even say like you're a freelancer, that is something that can be taken into account when moving into Portugal. But if you're moving to Italy, getting an entrepreneurial visa can be very difficult. There's a limit on them per year, and you have to fit very specific criteria. So making that move happen can be a bit on the tricky side. But even, for example, as somebody like myself who is an Italian citizen and can come to Portugal living here as somebody who is from the EU, in some ways, getting residency here was almost as easy, if not maybe slightly easier, than moving as an Italian citizen to Italy. Granted, I did have to bring more documentation to show them and prove to them certain things, but because of the current global situation, I was able to do a lot of this by email, and I really only ever had to show up to just confirm some of the information and sign a few documents. There really wasn't that much that was involved with it. But in Italy, I didn't find that was the case for my situation, at least for the first time that I moved to the country. During this current situation, I did have a move that I did into a different apartment, and there was an aspect of that I was able to complete via just email, just regular email. But in Italy, there is the added interesting part of this process that you do have a police officer or somebody representing the police that will come and do a residency check at your apartment. In Portugal, that's not the case. As I'm going through this episode, I'm seeing that I actually have a really long list of items. So I think this may have to be divided up into a series of videos. So if you're interested in that, be sure you let me know down in the comment section below. And also, if you're interested in any specific topics about what specifically you would be interested in comparing and contrasting, let me know down in the comment section here on YouTube. If you're listening to this as an audio only podcast, come on over to YouTube and let me know here, or feel free to send me a message on Instagram. But the next thing that I do want to talk about that is kind of involved with moving to the country would be opening up a bank account. Granted, you don't necessarily have to do this, but if you are going to be working here, it's probably a good idea unless you're earning your income from another country and you're getting paid in that country. But then if you're doing that, you're also starting to raise some complications potentially for yourself. But I'm not a financial advisor or a legal advisor or a tax advisor, so definitely seek out the services of somebody who is a professional and can advise you on your specific situation. But my experience of opening up a bank account here was a bit more involved. As some of you know from recent episodes that where I've talked about this a little bit more, I'll keep this very short because I have talked about it recently. But my experience opening up a bank account in Italy, granted as an Italian citizen, but even for the people who I know who are not Italian citizens, I would say it's probably a lot easier to do there. You just open it up on the spot. You have access to it. You are available. Here, that may or may not be the case. There does seem to be at least one bank where if you are approved for the account, you get it on the spot. Whereas there are a lot of banks here, you have to go through an approval process. But anyway, like I said, I'm going to keep this one short. If you want, you can watch more recent episodes of mine where I do talk about this, especially the episode about opening up a company here in Portugal. But then let's talk about healthcare, because that is something that will be attractive to many people who are thinking about relocating to Europe. Socialized healthcare, nationalized healthcare that you can find in the different countries here. So in this case, I can't say that there's one country that's truly better than the other. I can't say that Italy is the winner or that Portugal would be the quote unquote winner. There are interesting aspects of each system. So if we look at it from just a practical level of the ratings by the World Health Organization, Italy comes up at almost the top. It's what, the third or second? It's always very high within their rankings for the overall public medical system. However, the private medical system in Italy, while it can actually be wonderful, it can be very pricey. And I have heard people say that it actually can be not far off from the expenses that you might find in the US. However, in Portugal, while the public system doesn't rank as high as Italy, the private system here is supposed to be fantastic from what I've been told. Thankfully, so far, I haven't had to deal with the healthcare system here in Portugal. So I can't say I've had much personal experience. Actually, years ago, I did have to go to the doctor here once, and that was going to a private doctor because I was on vacation at the time. But what I can say, though, is that on the private system here, the prices that I've seen are very cheap, and at least in comparison with most countries, and almost quite reasonable, even if you're paying out of pocket every month. It depends, of course, on your needs and what you have to go through and what kind of coverage you need. However, from what I've been hearing so far, the concept of private health insurance here doesn't seem as far out of reach as it does maybe in some other parts of the world where I've spent time. A quick little note, just kind of while we're on healthcare, it's not directly related, but indirectly related: handicap accessibility. In reality, I would say that probably both countries are pretty much at a tie. You have a lot of older buildings here, and so this can lead to situations where maybe you'll have apartment buildings that don't have elevators, which is, of course, not uncommon even in the States. But also, it does seem more common that people do live in apartment buildings in Europe than in the States. Of course, you do have single-family homes or townhomes where you could have that ground floor access. But wheelchair accessibility is definitely not like what you would find in the States, where you have ramps, parking, all different sorts of things that you find that make various aspects of life more accessible to those who need it. So there have been a few of you who've left comments about that or have messaged me privately. So I did briefly just want to touch on that unfortunately, when you're looking at some of these parts of the world, accessibility can be a little tricky, at least in comparison to the US. It's not as accessible as you would find there. But of course, with this whole coming to Italy part, you're also going to need a place to live. And so let's talk about renting or purchasing an apartment or a home here in Portugal. I would say in comparison to Italy, it's not all that far off. It really, in some aspects, I would say if maybe you're a bit further out of a city, the point could go to Portugal. However, in reality, I would say I find things to be very similar. Although if you are in, say, Milan, Rome, or Florence, maybe in the downtown areas there, some of the luxury apartments there would probably end up costing more than what you might find in, say, Lisbon or Porto, or maybe just outside of Lisbon in Cascais, because that's supposed to be one of the most expensive areas in the whole country. But if you do start going outside of the towns and cities, again, they're not going to be too far off from one another, but maybe the advantage would go slightly to Portugal, unless you're talking about specifically like the south of Italy, like south of Italy, the heel of the boot, the tip of the boot, or Sicily. You're talking about a lot lower prices than you would find in a lot of other places. But you can also find property in Portugal that would be in what you might consider a more desirable part of the country. I'm not saying more desirable than Italy. I'm just saying within the confines of Portugal, you'll find desirable areas that are still quite low in price, and the ability to buy a huge piece of land for a very fair price. Of course, you can find this in Italy, but the difference, I would say, is that there seems to be a lot less available here. Okay, granted, of course, it's a much smaller country with a much smaller population, but there seems to be a bit more demand here than there does in Italy. I've seen a lot more apartments in Italy that will stay open and just will stay on the market for a while. Whereas here in Portugal, I've been doing a lot of research around the country and places are going quick here. And that's both on the rental and the sale market. The rental market, though, seems to be moving a lot faster, especially in the more major areas, or even not major, but some of the more popular destinations, like I was talking about recently, like in the Algarve, Lagos. Things right now there seem to be actually going pretty quickly. Here in Braga, lightning speed. Lisbon, also very quick. So that's also something to keep in mind, that you may have a bit more searching to do, and also that you will want to act fast on what you may find here in Portugal. In Italy, that can be the case depending on where you are. But again, in my personal opinion, it seems like things are moving a lot faster here. But the last thing that I think I want to talk about in this episode will be the ease of getting around the country. In Italy, I think in many ways, it's very easy to live without a car, especially because in Italy, you have a very robust train system. It goes to a lot of different places, and to be able to get to those trains generally isn't very difficult unless you're really far out in the country. But I would say to an extent, you have something similar here in Portugal. There's a pretty extensive train system, but I might give the advantage to Italy. However, the big caveat here is that in Portugal, the costs are a lot less, or at least they can be a lot less. And I'm talking about like for an equivalent distance to an equivalent destination in both countries. Maybe I've seen some tickets here that are anywhere from say 30 to 50 or more % less than what you would find in Italy. But also in Italy, you do have some very nice trains available to you, like the Frecciarossa, or even the Freccia Bianca. And then also here in Portugal, you have different types of trains and different levels of trains that are available to you, all with different levels of comfort that come along. But then you have the kind of more what you would call in Italy like a regional train or an intercity train that can also still be a lot cheaper than what you might find in Italy as well. So there's something to consider there with the cost of getting around. Having a car, though, in Portugal, I might say might be in some ways a little more necessary potentially, and also potentially even a little bit more reasonable. But in Italy, though, of course, because it's a bigger country, to be able to get around, there will be those times that having a car will be a greater advantage. Of course, having your own private transportation, shocker, much more convenient. But from what I've been able to gather so far, and without quoting any exact numbers here, it does seem as though the cost of operation on the annual scale of having a car may actually have an advantage more in Portugal, at least financially speaking. That lower cost is what I'm talking about. But also another thing is that in Italy, you do have buses to get from one place to another. However, I might give the advantage again to Portugal in this way, because there are a lot of buses here that seem to be more integrated into national systems to get you around more easily. In Italy, I've noticed that there are a lot of times, like if you're trying to take a bus, it's not necessarily that you go to a bus station, you go to some kind of random place on the edge of town that you have to get to before you can take the bus to get to another edge of town, to get to another random location. Whereas in Portugal, I have seen more places where you have a central bus station. Maybe it's not exactly in the center of the city, but it is in a location that seems to be almost more accessible. This is just my experience, what I've personally seen. And I'm not saying this is always the case, but something again where I would say maybe it's a little bit more easy in some ways in Portugal. And again, of course, lower cost. Anyway, I think this is where I'm going to end this episode off. And like I said, I've got plenty more comparisons that I can make between these two beautiful, wonderful countries that I have been able to call home at one time or another. And so if you're interested in seeing more episodes like this, be sure that you let me know down in the comment section below, and let me know if there are any specific comparisons that you would be interested in hearing about. Of course, also a huge thank you to those of you who helped to make these episodes possible through rafaeldifuria.com/Patreon or rafaeldifuria.com/support, or for the shirts, mugs, onesies, and more, shop.rafaeldifuria.com. Thank you all so very, very much for being a part of this and helping to allow these episodes to be able to be possible. Also, thank you to those of you who've been watching and subscribed to this channel and who always give the likes and thumbs up to these videos on YouTube. Of course, be sure that you share these episodes with your friends or family who may be interested in moving abroad. It is very appreciated and of course really does help out the channel here on YouTube. Or if you've been listening to the audio only podcasts, it really does help those out as well. So thank you all so very much. Of course, as always, this has been another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. I'm Rafael de Furia, and I will see you all next time. Later.